Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute, founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, and author of the new book, Agency. You got yours, Shamika, too? Hold it up, put it up.
Isn't that like a nice, happy, sunny?
Yes, it's bright. It's nothing like the current culture. So hopefully we'll fix something to that, right?
Yes. Hopefully we're going to feel good at the end of this conversation.
So it's Agency. The subtitle is so long, I'd have to sit here and read it. But people mocked me on my first book, so I'm not going to give you a hard time. But check it out. And we're going to talk about this. And Ian, welcome to the show.
Great to see you, Charles. Great to see you, Will. Great to see you, Shamika. Not in the order of importance.
Of course not. Obviously not. Probably reverse importance, but we want to
reverse order, really.
Yeah, that's what I figured. But I'm used to that with these two. But the book is simply titled Agency, so I guess we should start there. What and why Agency?
Wow. Well, Charles, thank you for diving right in. You don't want to know about my background, or
who cares about all that?
What led me to this definition of agency.
Well, it's in the book, and between your definition and me picking some things out of it, I think it's going to come up.
Okay, so all right, so 2 minutes of background. So no, I'm very proud to have written a book called Agency because I do believe it can be the empowering alternative to a lot of the negative messaging that young people are hearing today about all of the things that they cannot do in our country and what they do have the power to achieve if they want to lead a life of flourishing, right? Mm-hmm. So, I've worked for years in schools, and I've really developed this idea that when I see young people today, there are these two dominant narratives I'll talk about real quick, blame the system and blame the victim. If you're in this country, you're not successful, you're not achieving the American dream, then it's America itself. It's a systemically oppressive nation based on race or gender or some other characteristic. There's a white supremacist lurking around every corner, Charles.
I see them.
Capitalism itself is evil, and these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, you as an individual are powerless to overcome, right? And that's why you need big government intervention to come in. But on the other side, blame the victim says, if you're not successful, it's not America's fault. America's great. It's your fault.
The bootstraps.
Right? Yeah. Why didn't you pull yourself up by the bootstraps? Why did, you are the architect of your own failure, right? Something you didn't do. And so that completely ignores what happens when young people might be born into situations where they're not part of a strong family or don't have a strong faith commitment or don't have access to great schools. It's really hard to pull up your bootstraps. But both of these narratives, in my view, add up to a singular lie. And they're robbing young people, in my view, of their belief in their own ability to lead the life that they want for themselves. And so I define agency as hopefully this new framework, the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. Mm-hmm. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So think of agency as a vector or velocity. Think back to your physics and geometry classes, where velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction, right? So if each one of us has free will, where does the ability to become morally discerning come from, right? Because there's lots of people who have free will, but they don't necessarily lead lives of flourishing, right? So I put forth a framework called FREE, which we can go through, which is family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. FREE. Those are the pillars upon which an agentic life, a life of flourishing, are built. And so I've written Agency to describe my framework that I'm trying to put forth as an alternative to blame the victim and blame the system.
Well, that's a mouthful, but it definitely sets up the conversation and the importance of agency and importance of what you do and what you write about. And so it sounds like to further summarize, you're saying that there are things that you can do if you take ownership of what you do as a child, or as someone who is struggling through situations, that can greatly improve your and increase your chances of succeeding. But there are things along the way that people can do, and things along the way, organizations, groups, family, whether it's internal or external, that can help you and guide you in the right direction. You say without both of these, it becomes increasingly difficult to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I run schools, right, is I want my students to know that they can do hard things, and that life, hello, I'm going to break the surprise. Life is not fair, right? And every kid of every race, of every background is going to face a series of challenges. Sometimes those challenges might be structural in nature. Like if you're a Black kid, you hear all the time, well, there's systemic racism, there's institutional racism, there's structural, systemic racism. They're all
environmental. They come in a lot of flavors.
They come in a lot of flavors. But there's also surmountable racism, right? So we have to create a mechanism by which young people recognize that there will be barriers that you will face, but you have the ability to overcome them. But you don't have to overcome them alone. There are institutions like the family, and I'll talk about, because it's not the family that you're from, it's the family you form. Faith, education, and if you build that foundation, then your access to create an entrepreneurial life is significantly enhanced.
Okay, before we really dive into the book, I want to let Will and Shamika just talk about a bit about what they believe and what they think about the summary of your book. Will.
Jamaica?
Oh, Will went to Shamika. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go after that.
Well, I think you said Jamaica. I was about to go yardy on you. Okay, cool.
What I think it did for me, this book, was to kind of help me. I think I lean more towards blaming the victim. And I think because my mother, had me at 15, I'm a product of rape, but I feel like she didn't give me any excuses. Like I still, went through high school, graduated, went to college. I didn't have, babies young. And I think I leaned towards that simply because I was like, I was able to pull myself up and, I could do this. But what I liked about your book was that it caused me to actually look at everything that I actually had as a child that I never really paid much attention to. Like I was in church. I was very involved in church. I was very involved in community activities. And so it allowed me to see that it wasn't like, I didn't do this on my own. I actually had church family that helped, and I had a good, community involvement that helped. So I had that, even though I wasn't in a 2-parent home, I had a good family, I had religion, I had education, which led me to entrepreneurship. And it's like, oh, okay, now I can actually see that there were kids that that didn't have that. And so it just allowed me to be able to like really reflect to see, okay, don't so much lean towards blaming the victim, because some of these kids, even though they grew up with you, they didn't have the everything that I had in my life to play a part, helping me to become more successful. So I that opened my eyes, and I want to say thank you. I was still probably victim blame a little bit.
But a little less now.
Okay.
A little less.
Shamika, that's really deep. I appreciate you saying that. Actually, I'm glad it actually touched you. I didn't know that about your background. So that's powerful.
Yeah, I have 2 quick questions. Like the first one, in terms of what Shamika said, is sort of practical. Like, how do you distinguish agency from this idea of the system and the victim? And just as a quick intro there, in the social sciences, almost everything is either systemic or individual. in terms of how people analyze it. So you would say either that what influences someone in terms of how they perform is, for example, culture, which I think is a big thing when you look at immigrant communities, but also racism, which still greatly reduced, but is there. Systemic factors like what's the welfare policy in a country. So that's on the one hand. And then I think on the other hand, you have the individual. So like what's your IQ bluntly, but what's, I think even more important, what's your level of grit? What's your level of aggression? You know, how attractive are you is going to be a big thing in a lot of fields. So you have that, and obviously for all of us, the answer is 10 out of 10. But
Very.
I mean, so you have bar one and bar two, and you seem to be talking about something that's different. So what is agency? Is that somehow inspiring the person so they can get the most out of category two? Like how would you separate that in kind of methods terms?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting frame. So yes, it would be more in category two, but guided, right? So let me give you an example. So where I run schools, in District 8 in the South Bronx, right? Only 2% of kids graduate from high school ready for college, right? Which is a crazy, meaning that meaning that they start ninth grade, and along the 4 years, somewhere they drop out, or they actually do earn their high school diploma, but still can't do reading and math if they were to actually go to college, right? So which is worse, you drop out, or you actually do what you're supposed to do, but you're still not effectively prepared, right? So, and this has been going on for generations. But in the districts in which we run schools, there's a cap on charter schools, right? Mm-hmm. So if you had a great idea to launch a school in these neighborhoods, you couldn't do it, right? So that's an example of a real systemic barrier. Like a 12-year-old can't solve that problem, right? So there are real barriers, and I include those, some in the book, that are policy oriented, that we need to move away those structural blockades for your ability to exercise agency. So we do have to address the elements of blame the system that might ring true. Now, let's say you did have great schools, right? And so now you can attend the school of your choice. So now it's up to you as a kid, right? So the question is, free will, it's about the individual, right? The individual unbridled can do anything he or she wants, right? The question is, how is it channeled? How is it directed? So in a sense, I'm agreeing with you that it's either about the environment, the external forces, or it's all about your internal forces. The point I'm trying to raise is that the internal forces left unto themselves, necessary, but not sufficient. It's like people who focus on grit, right? I even draw a distinction in the book between agency and grit. Like grit is dogged self-determination. I'm going to persevere no matter what. But the thing is, if you don't believe that your actions are really connected to your future life outcomes, you won't develop that dogged self-determination. You won't believe, you don't have that sense of agency, that your effort links to your long-term outcomes. And so I am trying to thread the needle here, because I could see how one could construe this. Well, you're just saying it's all about the individual. Yes, and agency is the force of your free will, guided by moral discernment. Does that help in drawing? It does.
And there's also a really interesting idea here that people who actually write about free will, as I think all you guys know, touch on, which is that one of the best ways to exercise true free will is to have someone else help you with it. So if you want to stop drinking and you commit to do that, enlist your buddies or your wife. And there's going to be some kind of protocol that you can put in place there. I recently did this with physical health. That's going to actually work much better than just you saying, I'm going to do this. So it sounds like you're saying that there's a big element of helping someone else, getting to the point, there's a big element of helping someone use their free will, especially if you're working with kids. Like unless you know how to say cook or apply for a job or a bunch of other things, like the limit to which you can be free-willed is actually very low, which is why mentoring young men and so on is so important.
So in the book, we just lost Will.
I'm sure he'll be back.
Yes, I'm sure he'll be back too, because I'm about to drop some brilliance right now, and he needs to hear it.
He needs to hear it. We'll tape it.
Right, exactly.
Well,
How about we make
while
this
we're waiting
podcast?
on Will, let me say this. When you said that you were in September of 1977, you were 12, I said, damn, I didn't realize you were that old. So let me say, you look marvelous for your waiting.
You look marvelous, really you do.
And that's marvelous with an H, not an R.
Yes, marvelous.
Buddy. Now an old man's gonna lose his train of thought.
No. So, no. Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate that. What I was going to say in response to Will is this idea that, free will is, how you're helped. Is that in the book I introduced the work of Urie Bronfenbrenner, who's a famous, he developed a whole theory of human development, where it's very simple, but basically what he says, with the child at the center, you're raised in a series of layered and concentric circles, right, that radiate out. In the immediate, in the center, radiating are those institutions that have the greatest proximity to you, right? Your family, faith, school, and then it slowly radiates out, like your neighborhood, social policy, government, media, all these forces that aren't necessarily aligned with your values. And so the stronger the core who's helping you, that's the stronger the core that's helping you learn. Will, I'm answering your question. I'm answering your question using
You're a pro. You just kept going. All right.
He said, come back because he's dropping knowledge.
Yes, man. I'm sorry. So Urie Bronfenbrenner had this theory, this bio-ecological model of human development, which is common sense, but the institutions with greatest proximity to you are the ones, in your words, Will, that help guide you on how to deploy your free will. And so if that core, which is family, faith, education, is not strong, then all these other forces like social media, popular culture, government policy, those actually seep in to have much greater influence over how you exercise your free will. So if we don't reanimate those core institutions, then we have a lot of young people with free will, but without the ability to exercise it effectively.
That would be lost. Now, when did Urie write that?
Wow. So he developed this theory. So he started this in the late 60s. So Urie Bronfenbrenner, most people don't know, is the father of Head Start.
Oh, okay.
One of the ideas that came out of this theory of human development was that in his eye, the government had to be more proactive in strengthening families to create this kind of cocoon for very, very young children, even before formal schooling started. So he was one of the early designers of Head Start. But the ecological theory, he was testifying to Congress in the late 60s.
No, I say that because you made a point at the end of that. You were like, which is really common sense. And I was like, because I'm no scholar, but I wrote that in my first book. I wrote that very same thing about the same layers. You got to get closer to the kid and what will happen if you don't, the whole thing. And then the other thing, when you talk about the Head Start, the reason why he implemented it, it's funny because what we got, which kind of, takes us to the government problem, was the exact opposite of it, right? So they implemented Head Start. Everybody knows Head Start, but you talked about why he did it. Well, what they did was totally different. It was to get government, to get government into the kid earlier, as opposed to get the government to, promote family.
It's with like so many of these policies, right? If you were to go back in time and ask the people who had the good intentions and they designed this 50 years later, if they were to look at the institution that they created, they might be horrified. And I would be really curious to hear what Urie Bronfenbrenner would say. He's not with us anymore. That it was not his intention. We don't want to weaken the core unit, right? We want to facilitate ways to make it stronger.
Right. I know. And I got kind of a flow, but I'm like, I got to get as much of this as I can in this short amount of time. So I'm gonna jump around. And because of what Will mentioned, and you talk about trying to, the third way, in a sense, combine the two, and talking about what seeps in. You run Well, you obviously opened this international baccalaureate high school in the South Bronx in weeks, which is crazy. But you ran 5 single gender schools in New York before that for what, 10 years or so.
Yep,
So
yep.
you understand this. And we talk about education a lot here. We had Denisha Merriweather on last week. We've had Natalie Wexler on. I've had her on the show a couple times. And so it's funny that you talk about this stuff in the book. And so I kind of want to jump ahead to this. We know what works. You make a clear point in the book. You talk about the problem, but you say adults in the room know stuff. We read studies. We know what works. We know what doesn't work. We have people like you who run schools, and yet we don't do it, right? And that just fascinates me. You quoted Natalie, but the funniest thing is the Bill and Melinda Gates thing. So if I can find it real quick, I'm gonna read it. But you talk about when you were working with them, and he put $1 billion in education. I mean, we need good intentions. We're gonna help these lower income kids. Spent 17 years, $1 billion. Wrote this long report about how we just didn't get measurable impact. It didn't work. Things were bad. We spent this money, and we found out
largely the same today
right,
as they were before our billions in 17 years.
Right. And we learned, what we did learn was we haven't, cracked the code, but what we did learn is, like you said about the ecosystem there, if we only focus on what's in the school, we can't fix this. And then he said nothing about family, even though he stayed together in his marriage until, his kids got out of school before he divorced, and said it. And then he dropped another $2 billion in education that did nothing.
Right. So what this all means, Charles, is that the Gates Foundation is not funding Vertex Partnership Academy.
The long and the short.
Hopefully there'll be some other funders that look
right.
Well, I do think.
What? Go ahead.
Just quickly to jump on Charles's point, though, I do think that this is something that I hear a lot, actually, just Black community, business community, people talking about this. One of the ideas that seems to be under the surface with education is there really isn't much we can do with these kids. And you keep hearing people cite things like, for example, in Kansas City, a judge ordered the school district after they were supposed to desegregate to do all of these things, like build Olympic-sized swimming pools in the schools, like computer on every desk. And what they found is that the test scores for all of the racial groups got no better. In fact, they got worse. There was at least as much ethnic tension as there was before. It sounds like Bill Gates. I mean, the total cost of something like 19 billion, not much happened. And at the same time, coming from like my space on the center right, I mean, you hear people like Roland Fryer or Tom Sowell say, well, when we actually work with charter schools, they're pretty obvious things that work, like longer hours in the classroom or working with families. Yep. So I guess the question would be, I think I might be jumping on Charles's question here, but what does work? Is it as simple as it sounds?
Well, is it as simple as it sounds? So there's the ideas,
and then there's more better teachers.
Right, and then there's the execution, because those are two, and which is why I actually think it's important for people like us who talk about these issues a lot. It's to also to put ourselves in the situation where we're actually running institutions that are trying to do these things that are so obvious, right? Because when I was at the Gates Foundation, right, and I had done a lot in and around education, it seemed like we kind of know the answer. Why doesn't it happen? So back in 2010, I said, all right, you know what? I'm going to go start running schools. And you try to do all of these things, longer hours, time spent studying, more time for family engagement. And yes, I think generally charter schools, not all of them, but generally have shown that there are distinct practices that can make a difference at scale, really important. And yet there isn't widespread adoption of these practices. So why is that? Well, schools can't solve everything. And I just think sometimes we put too much pressure on schools to solve all the issues that kids enter. And I can share you my own story with the Who's Your Daddy truck, my realization of the importance of family. So I have come to the conclusion, great schools, there are tactics that are replicable that can make tremendous gains in creating opportunities for school. But those tremendous gains could be far better if the other key institutions in that Bronfenbrenner core were also functioning well, right? And so that means, how do we create more strong families that are more stable for kids going forward, right? So it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. How do we have more kids being raised in strong, faith-based communities? Again, I'm happy to dive into why I made religion part of my framework, but the evidence is overwhelming that when you have strong families, strong faith commitment, then the onus on schools is not so burdensome that you can't get the kind of outcomes that you would by practicing the things that you're talking about, Will. Believe me, high expectations, rigorous homework, teachers accountable, authorizers who, put pressure on schools when they're not performing. We know these things. We do. And we just run from it. And that's where I get very frustrated with a lot of my colleagues who, it's like KIPP, the charter school network, was one of the pioneers, in demonstrating that you could have great outcomes with kids. Work hard, be nice was their slogan for 25 years, right? Because they proved that you could do great things even in challenging situations. And a couple years ago, they were like, work hard, be nice. This thing, meritocracy,
It's racist.
It's an illusion. Like the one thing you gave to kids in tough situations, work hard, be nice. Your effort matters, your character matters. Nope. And so they abandoned that slogan. So I feel like even the people that stood up for what the tactics that you're talking about, Will, even they're like, no, it's not enough in the face of this system. And I'm just determined to battle against that and show that there is a pathway.
Well, everything you said is true. The only thing I would say, and obviously it's going to sound after this, your wonderful your breakdown of the situation, too simplistic. But I always say, I do think the answer is simple. It's just doing it that's hard.
Execution.
Right. It's because, and I don't put and I totally agree with you, people put too much on the school. So even if we had, 1,000 Ians, things will be better for exponentially more kids, but it doesn't fix all the problem. But that's not what I'm saying. When I say the solution is easiest, we know, like I just talked about, you, Natalie Wexler, all these other people, we know what the solution is. So if we taught the kids the right way, we stop focusing on what we're focusing on in school now, having a big debate about gender and 1619, right? And we focused on what worked, longer hours, all that stuff. And the government helped. Helping you, the push and pull of family and other and tax credits and things of that. And
creating food choice, right?
Right. And nonprofits came in to do the part that school can't do. So we got the ad council, right? They've been running ads for 50 years on all different things culturally, right?
Yep.
From This Is the Brain on Drugs all the way up to the things they do now. Sometimes I see the stuff they do now and I kind of roll my eyes, right? But why can't they say, give you tips on why you shouldn't have children when you're young, or like you wrote about, which I even learned, that's why the book is great. So the teen pregnancy and all that kind of stuff you point out, he's like, yeah, but they stopped there and they didn't say, also don't have kids without getting married. So then they say, we won because far fewer people are having kids when they're 14, but they're still having kids when they're 24 or 23, but they're not married. Right. So they can do simple things like that. We spend money on stuff all the time. Ad council, organization, nonprofits come in and say, how you talk about agency but being guided. How can a kid decide I want to be a cop or a football player, or maybe I want to be an actuary or something else that pays well, but I've never seen it if nobody comes and takes them out of the community. So those organizations, not enough of them exist, or they're not, laser focused on these different aspects. So I think if we had people and organizations doing filling the gaps, then it would work.
So what's interesting about what you're saying is, execution. So about a month ago in the subways of New York City, there are these ads put on by the city government that basically say, it's okay if you're using drugs. Mm-hmm. You can meth, all these things. And literally it's basically, they're trying to remove the stigma around abuse of really hard drugs, mm-hmm. right? And literally they have, don't use drugs alone, use it in moderation. Like they're literally guiding you. This is on a subway ad where 5-year-olds are seeing this stuff, right? And it's embraced. Yeah. These ads are embraced. However long ago, I write about this in the book, Robert Doar, current head of American Enterprise Institute, he was in New York City. He had an ad campaign which said, if you finish your education, full-time work, and if you have children, marriage first, 97% of kids avoid poverty. And it was these jarring ads. The level of pushback was unbelievable.
Right.
So, but you don't really realize this until you actually try to step into the arena and face the forces of people who are determined to not share the best practices.
Right.
And so that is what I am learning. And that's why I'm trying to write this book, to say, look, we got to dive deep into the sort of pathologies of the people who know the answers, but are actively depriving it, especially from young people.
And I told you that I'm working on something in Chicago. I'm gonna let you open your school first, but I'm gonna need your assistance with that. It is all filling in those other gaps. It's really pouring into that stuff. So I think that you'll really be interested in that. But Shamika, you were gonna say something. Ask what you're gonna say, but also I want you to comment on the ad that he saw and throw in, because I know your daughter really wants to come to New York. That there are also ads on the trains. Well, they have been. I don't know if they're on there now on the subways. That destigmatizes sex work. Right? It's saying that prostitution is cool. Sex work is great, right? Because I guess pimps are really just managers, and they get their.
Well, you've got to buy your crack somehow. I mean, that crack's not just that's not given away in the Big Apple, man.
Right. And when you use it, don't do it alone. Do it in groups and do it slowly.
Do it with your prostitute.
Well, it's literally telling junkies to find a crack house. Like, I've seen some of those ads, and it's like the safest place is an indoor location with multiple people. Like, yeah, well, is there a term for that? I don't know.
Probably a government-funded crack house. Shamika?
No.
Yeah, well, Charles, as far as New York goes, thankfully, they moved the trip to spring break of next school year. So I'm hoping, something else.
That what would happen, buddy?
Something. But I think what I was going to say kind of ties into this whole ad thing. What about the church? Since you talk about religion as a part of F.R.E.E., I think the church, especially in the Black community, used to be more of a moral authority.
Yeah.
So the church is not, in my opinion, doing their job. They don't really, in my opinion, they've started to kind of cater to single women. They don't really talk much about having sex outside of marriage or preaching against anything that's actually in the Bible. They've opened up the home, you can be gay and be a pastor, or be gay and lead the choir, and whatever goes, live how you want to live. It's okay. Let's just be nice. We're all family. And some of that, I guess, is good, but they've lost the moral authority that they used to have. And so I feel like if we're talking about, tackling things on all sides, that the church, the religious part, has really kind of failed and just been watered down over the years, that I don't even know if they have the ability to uphold that. When I was growing up, there may be some things that I would do, but once I was on the church ground, I wasn't going to curse. I wasn't going to disrespect, the elders or the deacons, or, and now people don't care. They're shooting and killing, not just on the church ground, they're walking in the church. And so to me, that moral authority is not what it used to be.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. So when I first started writing my book, Agency, I actually was only going to talk about this thing called the success sequence, like this whole sort of economic framework of education, then work, then marriage, then children. If you do these things, it's really hard to be in poverty. And it was, really almost like a technical layout. I didn't have the concept of F.R.E.E. at all when I first started writing. But I thought, the more and more I thought about what you just said, this idea that I was going to put forth lacked a moral dimension, right? It lacked, like, where is the church? I mean, there's so many topics that are facing our country. If you're of a certain color, you're an oppressor. If you're of a certain race, you're oppressed. And like, what about human dignity and individual aspects? And where's Where's that voice, that moral voice that existed for so long? And it's not that it doesn't exist, because we can't go that hard. But in terms of the larger debate, the faith community, in my view, faith leaders have not played the adequate role that they could, especially with young people. I mean, if you look at religious categories that young people say they belong to, the category of the highest naming, none, right? No affiliation. So that's why they're called nuns, right? And you see high levels of loneliness, alienation, isolation, depression. But then when you look at kids who do, for example, have a personal faith commitment in their life, tremendous differences in terms of they are part of a community, they are part of rituals with real people in real life that care for them, that love them. And so I want to just reintroduce young people to the idea that a faith commitment, it's not like a hokey thing. You can gain real power and strength out of that. And again, this is a counter narrative to what is not even on the radar of a lot of young people. So last thing on religion, I also talk in the book, it's not only about the power of having a personal faith commitment. I'm also trying to encourage religious organizations to become more involved in schooling, to bring moral, character-based education as an option for parents. And the Supreme Court made a huge decision just recently that if a state decides to subsidize education for a parent who wants to choose a certain type of school, they can no longer ban schools run by religious institutions. That's a huge, huge deal to make it more possible for parents who do want their kids to have exposure to that moral voice that you're talking about. That can now happen. That's an example of how government can actually play a role in liberating people to have more choice.
So back to F.R.E.E., you talked about family, you talked about religion, the next one's education. Because of Will's great question, we kind of, I think, did a good job of explaining the issue with the blame the victim side of the two problems you attack. But oh my God, blame the system. There's some serious stuff going there. You write in the book, obviously we're all our 1776 and we have issues with the 1619 projects, but about how it's important, how loving your country, or at least thinking that is good, can help you solidify that agency. And you talk about this race literacy quiz, and they ask a question that says the rise of white supremacy is caused by what? A, Indian removal, B, slavery, C, the Declaration of Independence, or D, the Constitution, or E, ancient Greece. And the answer was ding, 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 the Declaration of Independence, right? You have this the anti-racist. You talk about the equality versus equity. It's funny, you talk about that picture that everybody's seen of the three different height people standing on, one on the ground, two on two different boxes. And the first time I saw it, because I'm kind of a jerk, I was like, what do you think? Which one's being treated fairly? I'm like, they're all thieves. They should be paying by the ticket. None of them. Who cares? I mean, you don't have an inherent right to look over a fence, right? But you talk about that and how they, how this kind of thing, and it's seeping in education, which is why I'm sticking it with that E. I want to read something to you real quick because it just happened right before we recorded. So this woman tweeted something about this wonderful article about DEI and this kind of equality stuff, equity stuff, and this is great and it's excellent. I read the article, it's not that excellent. So she's like, well, what do you mean? She said, oh, so you're opposed to the redistribution of wealth, fundamentally sharing what the earth generously provides in reciprocal and respectful ways, rather than allowing it to be hoarded, exploited by a few in your vision of undangerous world. So I just replied, can you give me some examples of where the earth, what examples? She talked about all these things that the earth gives. And I said, great, so does the earth provide these things equitably before they're extracted, hoarded, and distributed? So I'm just trying to give her an argument and say, okay, people are bad, human nature is flawed, they rob, steal, and pillage. But you keep saying the earth gives everybody equally. But if we just left the earth alone, who do you think is mining stuff, right? If you take the human out of it, some of us live by fresh water while some of us don't. Some of us live in hot climates while some don't. The earth doesn't give us anything equally. So what is this equality, this equity you think the earth would give just naturally if no evil humans mess with it. But this is their mindset, and this is what they're teaching in schools.
Yes. So, I mean, that's a great story. I mean, the cartoon that you're talking about, which I hope most people have seen, you know, it's very simple. It's actually, this is where I think a lot of the progressive left is actually very effective in communicating complex ideas in a very simple fashion. But here's an image where you have a baseball field, and there's a kid who's short and can't see, and then magically on the right, all of them can see with equal vision. Like, wow, that's a beautiful thing. There it is.
Oh, there it is in the book. She found it right on cue.
There it is,
We're
right?
professionals around here.
It looks beautiful, right? And each one of them has 3 boxes on the left, right? But what most people don't realize when you look at that second side, suddenly the box from tallest guy has been taken away from him and given to the shortest kid. So who is it that's sitting on top, you know, removing these boxes and determining, oh, you are of a certain height, or you are a certain color, or you are of a certain gender. You are already privileged. You already have too much. So I'm going to take that away and I'm going to give it to that guy. That is the very, very dangerous and slippery slope, because that's not, and that is the modern day version of equity, right? Some artificial interventions to create a false goal of equal outcomes versus differentiated supports, not by group, but by individual, right? The tallest person in the world you might assume, oh man, that guy's got a great life. He can see everything. And meanwhile, who knows? He got some other affliction that you would never know until you helped him, right? And then, you know, the short person might be Muggsy Bogues, like that guy can never be successful and yet can make it to the NBA or whatever. I'm using height as an example. But the point is, when we fall into the trap of always using artificial characteristics to make determinations about people, that's where the whole equity argument falls flat.
And for the record, that debate I had with that woman, that article was based on equal outcomes, which is why I got involved in it. And then the last thing on education is because Will writes about this, and obviously with stats and things of that nature, and you talk about this. The problem with this anti-racist thing, obviously I have my cultural and my moral issues with it and all this other stuff, but I'm a solutions guy, and it just flat out doesn't work, and it impedes the things we're talking about. And the one key you write about in the book is, because when you focus on all this other stuff, you don't have time to focus on other things that may be the problem. Even if racism is a part, what if there's 6 things, you're only looking at 1?
Yep.
But there's a piece where you're talking about test scores coming out when you were trying to decide where you should open school and that thing. You're talking about test scores and just a 2-mile difference, the kids over here and the kids going over here. And so you got an area here in New York, most of them were in the South Bronx, where in 2024, you got the results of the state test, and not a single, let me say it slow enough so people can hear it, not a single Black or Hispanic student passed the state exams.
Yep.
Not one, not a single one.
In about 70 schools, right? And
not a single one. Doesn't mean they couldn't read or do math at all, but they could not pass at their grade level the standardized test.
Yep.
And the last thing I talk about all the time is, like, in my book, I wrote about negative equality. So it's also equality. Will talked about this too. It's like, if I'm up here, you talk about the tall guy. If you can somehow shrink that guy and make him the same height as the other guy, it's still equality, right?
It's still equity. It's still equity.
It's still equity, right? So what they're saying is they're pushing, if only we can close this race gap. If only we can close this race gap and make it even, bring the Black kids up to the white kids. Excuse me, the white kids are failing too.
Hello.
And no one talks about that.
Well, I'm trying to talk about it, you know, and again, here's where I'm trying to be empathetic to the people who are so committed. You know, we got to love our kids. We got to close the racial achievement gap. That'll be the civil rights victory of our era. Like, okay, but do you realize that only 45% of white kids read at grade level and have for 30 plus years? So when you were talking about closing the racial achievement gap as some great achievement, that means universal mediocrity for everybody. And so I really, see, it's important, because if we can't just win arguments, we have to win the opportunity for all children, right? We have to step back and say, the goal isn't closing the gaps between identity groups. The goal is the gap between where we are and 100% achievement for everybody. Systemic racism is not the reason that only 45% of white kids read at grade level. There's probably some other issues. And maybe if we start focusing on those other issues, like lack of strong families, lack of study time at home, lack of access to school choice, maybe we'll see these other factors maybe represent 80 to 90% of the issues that we're talking about. And whatever, and I know Will does a lot of work in this area. It's not that racism isn't an issue, but it's when you think it's this and everything else is out and it's actually this, and your whole solution set is based on this idea that's, there's a white supremacist on every corner, then we've lost our ability to implement effective solutions.
Well, we keep referencing you. You might as well add your.
Yeah, I'm letting the conversation flow. I want you to ask the question, Shamika to jump in, say some things. But I had a question that I've been meaning to ask Ian that ties directly, Ian, into what you just said, which is reading through this book. One of the more refreshing things was that there wasn't, because I read a lot of Black scholarship on left and right, a constant obsession with race. And I think my own impression is that when you talk about a lot of this, when you talk about the structural and the individual and so on, I personally think that contemporary racism, not the cultural issues in the Black community because of the past, not even probably more relevant lower income in the Black community because of the past, but racism today has a really minor role when it comes to predicting how people are going to perform. And I'm not going to give my whole dinner party speech, but if you look at the most successful groups in this country, Indians, Nigerians, Jamaicans, it's just so on and on down the line, a bunch of non-white people, Chinese Americans. The most successful white group is Jewish Americans, who I hear have experienced some bigotry. So I don't think that there is today, I mean, with racism formally illegal since '64, an extraordinary effect of racism on the kids that we're talking about, the young men and women that we all want to help and mentor. But what's your take on that? I mean, what role does racism today play when it comes to the performance of kids you work with? Is that the elephant in the room, or is that something that we need to talk about 90% less than we do?
Yeah. Will, is your house still there? Did lightning just strike your house?
No. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, because you're offending God. Oh, by the way, I have a couple more quick comments before we go back to that question. But yeah, I mean, like, two things you said. I looked at my notes over to the side. One point, I would agree with pretty much everyone on the panel that equity in practice is usually the opposite of equality. I mean, equality is everyone gets an equal chance to take the test, on clean paper at a desk for 3 hours. Equity is whatever the scores on the test are, we're going to wind up with a proportional number of Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Jews. And I think in business, in the academy, we all know that that's pretty frequently how decisions are made. I'd also agree, by the way, that the focus on gaps between groups avoids a focus on overall performance. Like, it doesn't really matter if the average white score is 1,000 on the SAT, the average Black score is 950, if every member of both those groups is below the par that you'd want to see. So I agree, this is a distracting conversation. But anyway, this is just me talking to some extent. I mean, did the lightning strike my house? No. But I'm interested in your response.
No, but you had the reason I asked. Go ahead, finish. No, I'm just saying what's different. You have the courage to say what you just said, that racism matters, but it matters to a much far degree. There are people chanting in front of your house right now saying, what? How can you possibly say that? I need systemic racism as the culprit, because otherwise I don't have anything else to point to.
What does Shelby say? What do you do with freedom?
Yeah, that's a great question from one of the OGs. But I do think this actually just helped me realize something. Like, one of the things Ian said in this conversation that I thought was really deep was this comment that very often in social science and in education, we're looking at, excuse the language, shit that seems really obvious. Like, what makes people do better in school, present family, faith community, on the school side, long hours in the classroom, homework. Why don't we focus on that? Because the academy leans slightly to the left of Karl Marx. And so there's a constant attempt to focus on novel kinds of racism. I mean, so I've stereotype threat, implicit bias, microaggressions. They're over and over and over. There's the attempt to kind of discover something there. That's my view. And I think that's one of the reasons there's so little focus on what actually predicts, which is like study time. I mean, unless you're a genetic hereditarian, that seems to be like every article ever. But I mean, so what what is your thought process on that though? I mean, because originally this began as a question. What is the role of racism in the day-to-day life of these kids?
Yes. So the role, so look, I've written essays that say the diminishing role of race in our society. It is just, if we're being honest, and if we look at the success of, you just said, Nigerian Americans, and by the way, lots of native-born Black Americans who, by the way, just have certain practices. I mean, the poverty rate in the Black community for married Black couples has been in single digits for generations. So there must be some factors outside of race that are more determinative. And so we just need to be honest. And seriously, I've written this book, in some ways, I could have called it Courage versus Agency, because it's courage we need. It's courage to say obvious things. Now, the pendulum might be swinging a little bit because, you know, there are a few big decisions, you know, most notably at the Supreme Court, where, you know, if you know about the Harvard case, in which they're assessing whether or not affirmative action by race should continue. And this is an example where Harvard's admissions policies, if you look at the data, it is so evident that they have been discriminating against Asian students, high-performing Asian students, in favor of far less academically prepared Black students. And you can't look at the data objectively and come to any other conclusion. So I think it's very, very likely that the Supreme Court is going to overturn the ability of colleges and universities to discriminate on the basis of race in order to determine admission. But instead, they might, and very likely, schools, once that tactic is removed, schools will start making determinations based on class, based on economic status. And to me, that's interesting. Most Americans, I think, agree about fairness, that someone that's poor, whether they're white, Black, green, whatever, should get a leg up if they're academically qualified. The assumption that simply because you're Black, you should get a leg up. There are a lot of poor white people in Appalachia and other parts of the country who don't see that as fairness. So I think, Will, there is incrementally so growing recognition that race plays a far less factor, especially relative to these other forces around family, faith, and education.
One, and I'm glad to hear you say that, a quick follow, when you mentioned the idea of class-based, quote unquote, affirmative action, almost everyone I know would support that if the advantages were kind of reasonable. But the problem that I find is that the people that benefit most from race-based affirmative action are minority elites.
Exactly.
So, I mean, so if I think Van Jones, some of these brothers on MSNBC, your kid might do a little better, a little worse than his white buddy, but he's getting a 1,200, and that means he's going to Harvard because there is that 150-point Black edge. So Jones is not going to speak in favor of a policy that would benefit poor Korean and hillbilly kids. I mean, it's a blunt way of putting it, but it's just reality. Do you think we can get to a class system or a system with none of this at all?
I hope so. But again, I'm talking about it. I did a whole thing on the New York Times about this topic. I'm hoping the Supreme Court makes what is, in my view, the obvious decision. But, Harvard wants to keep saying we got lots of Black kids in our school, never mentioning that those
They're
Black
doctors and Nigerians.
Exactly. So, again, when the people who designed these policies, in the 1960s, when, affirmative action was designed in the way it's designed, and there was the Bakke case, and it was about race, there was a recognition that simply because of skin color, there actually was an inherent disadvantage based on the fact that laws had just been changed. So one could argue there were people even fighting against affirmative action, race-based affirmative action back then, but at least it was more plausible. Yeah. Now, if you look at the makeup of Black students in college, come on. And you have to go insulting to say the systems are so racist that if we didn't have race-based affirmative action, none of those kids would be able to make it on their own. It's just not true. It's just not true.
And if I want to make it, I think I'm going to go ahead and do this. I shouldn't, but make an unpopular comment, but especially in the Times. But I'm one of those people who think that they shouldn't have done affirmative action because I think it's unconstitutional. Stick with the Constitution. we can stick with the Constitution. And before the brothers attack me, now they're going to enjoy what I say, because I think the answer was reparations. I don't agree with it now, but I think that would have been the answer instead of doing that. I think they should have just constitutionally treat everybody the same. You all were behind. We start writing checks.
Very interesting.
They should have did that then.
They should have done it. Well, although back then in the 60s, the same thing was true now, was that there was a rising Black middle class.
Right.
That was very
But I can say Jim Crow was last week, right? And not slavery reparations, the Jim Crow reparations. But, we missed that. Shamika, tell me your takeaway from the book, and then Ian, tell me what the feedback's been like, because it's new. It's been a week or two. So, Shamika.
Yeah, I think my greatest takeaway is what I said earlier in the beginning about how I should just really look at things a little bit differently. I will say that I favor equality over equity simply because I don't care how tall I am. If I work for my box, I want it. Yeah, I ain't got nothing to do with that little short person that can't see the fence.
I still say buy a ticket.
Right. I think it should be obvious that race isn't like as big as people are seeing that it, or think that it is, because I can see that just on Twitter, like when people comment to me, I'm thinking there is no way that white person is smarter than me simply because they are white when they don't know the difference between your and your. That should just be obvious that it's not, because they're white. And so I think we should just stop kind of playing a game with them and, allowing them to keep running with this narrative that, oh, white people are just, they're privileged simply because they're white and they're better simply because they're white. That is something that I will not allow my children to ever believe. And anytime I see it, and this is why I think it's so important, family, as you said, and free is so important, because families have to be paying attention to what is even happening in education so that you can combat this and know that these things are being taught to your children. And I'm so grateful that I do have a close bond with my kids, that even when they see something that they know goes against what mom teaches at home, they bring it to my attention so that I can address it. And I realize that some of the kids don't have that. So family is very important. And I think we really have to start pushing how important family is and stop, as you said earlier, the school can't do it all. And I do think that there are a lot of people out here that look for the school to do it all. In my opinion, family is the number one thing that we have to bring back together and bring that importance back, because everything should filter through what you learn at home. And so I think we have to really focus on.
And if you don't teach them well, if you don't raise your kids right and free and all these other concepts that's actually putting the right things in order. I mean, they may grow up and be successful, but they may grow up and hypothetically sit around a table with other successful women drinking champagne and eating caviar, talking about how people mess up their hair.
Right, exactly.
And it's criminal and political, and they're doing it on purpose. Hypothetically, that could happen.
Hypothetically, and then go out and do it to your own hair when you relax it and bleach it blonde because you want to be white so bad. But
So let me just say one thing here, because I do think it's important to say, because obviously F in free, it's the anchor, it's the foundation for any healthy society. What I try to draw the distinction from, it's not about the family that you're from,
the one you make,
about the family you form, right? Because I have a lot of kids in our schools who are in great, wonderful families, but also kids who are in very challenging situations that they didn't choose, right? But the key that I try to impart is that it's not, you don't have to follow what has happened to you, right? I am not what happened to me. I am what I am about to become. So that's why it's so important. We help young people understand what are those pathways to create the kind of family that will be much healthy for me as well as my future children. Mm-hmm. In designing Vertex Partnership Academies, the new high school we're launching, I visited other schools across the country, and I visited a school in New Orleans, this great high school, ninth graders in a predominantly low-income community, multiracial classroom. So I asked the kids, hey, my name is Ian Rowe. I have a question. There's a topic I want to teach kids about, but it's very controversial because it has to do with family. And so I said, if you knew that there were a series of decisions in your control that people who follow it 97% of the time avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond, would you want to know that? And they looked at me, they were like, yeah, well, sure, why wouldn't we want to know that? And I said, well, there's some grown-ups who think that I might be insulting you or imposing middle class values on you, or, pushing things that somehow will offend you or your parents, And they looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, what are you talking about? Tell us, because we want to know, right? Let us decide what we do with the information, but tell us first. And so we then proceeded to have this whole conversation about what's called a success sequence, just a high school degree, full-time work, and if you have kids, marriage first. 97% of millennials avoid poverty. Not 100%, nothing in life is a guarantee. But what was interesting about the conversation with these ninth graders was that I think for the first time, they felt that someone actually treated them as future decision makers of their own life, right? That's what this is all about, giving you the power to make the choices that are best for you. And it just frustrates me to all hell when the gatekeepers, the elites who, represent the interests of the disadvantaged, they're like, no, we can't impose our values. No. We need to get around the gatekeepers and share with young people themselves the information that we know is so crucial. So that I just want to make that point about family, because I could hear the people, some people listening saying, yeah, but what about a kid who's born into a really tough situation? That is real. And, but you got to have the same high expectations for that kid as you do anyone else. We do him no favors. We do him no favors by succumbing to such empathy that we suffocate their sense of possibility.
Well, that's a great place to end. And it's a great story, although you can take negative on it and look at the glass half empty and say, why did these brilliant ninth graders understand that, yet the elites don't get it? But,
The elites are dumber.
Yeah, right.
And Will gave us the answer. He is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, and author of the new book, Agency. Ian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for a hopeful conversation. Hopefully you, hope and agency, no grievance and dependency. The U.S. of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.